The following is intended for informational purposes only. It is intended to supplement classroom training and documentation. It should not be relied on as a replacement or substitute for classroom training with a live expert instructor. Welcome to Lesson 11, Configuring Advanced Form Rule Settings. Here we will look at existing form rules that we have used in the earlier lessons and update them so that they can give us more functionality. One piece of functionality is that we can use them to support not only one taxpayer but have multiple taxpayers, in this case a primary and secondary taxpayer, so that we could have, let's say, a joint filing for a married couple, and we will show you how we do that and how we configure that, both on the form rules and also on the sections that need to be defined. Also, we will go back and have the ability to add in an address for this particular form, and again that requires going into existing form rules and updating them. And by the end of this lesson you will have an updated form with, as I said, the ability to have a joint filing as well as address in the form. Let us now add another form. This time we will see that the form not only has information for one person, but it has for two, a primary taxpayer and a secondary taxpayer. Think of it, let's say, as a married couple, a classic example of filing together. Let's see how this works, and then we'll see the form rules that I needed to update in order to be able to do this. So let me fill in my receive date. In my tax details, understand this as being like a joint tax form and a total for both parties, let's say. Okay, you would normally have much more details for each individual party, each different taxpayer, but think of it at the moment as just being a summary for both. Let me just go back to my personal details, and now let's fit in. This is the primary taxpayer. I have a little just a header over here. I'm going to call this person John Jones, and an ID type here of something like this. And then a secondary taxpayer, think of it as a spouse, let's say Susan Jones. And let me save that. And we will validate it. Everything works okay, and then we'll post. Come up with a warning, there's no address. We'll ignore that, and we will hopefully create the primary taxpayer and the secondary, and everything else that's needed. So you immediately see that we have two persons created, John Jones and Susan Jones. We have one joint account for both of them. Let's just see that everything is being created correctly. If I go to John Jones, I see the person. I see Dr. John Jones. I see his ID. Relationships. There are no relationships here at the moment. Well, sorry, there are. He's the main taxpayer. Sorry. No tax rolls. If I now go back to the tax form, I can click on his wife, person, secondary person in this case, and you will see that again these are added incorrectly. and the account is a joint account. It's the same account. It's related to account through a spouse. Is a spouse. If we go to the account itself, we will see that we have, again, we can look at the main taxpayer or the spouse. If you go to the persons associated with it, you'll see that there are two. There's the primary, which is the Dr. John Jones, and then the secondary as well, set as a relationship to be spouse. So we've now added into the form both parts to this, both primary and secondary. How was this done? What form rules did we have to create or update in order to deal with this? So if I go to my form rules, let me go back to the form type and look at the form rules that we have. And in fact, we didn't have to add any new form rules. We just simply updated 3. First one we did is on the validate step. It's the check. The second one, check taxpayer existence. I changed the title to check primary and secondary existence, and you'll see that there are a few extra settings. Just like here, I set for the primary the ID type, I set for the secondary as well. That's all I needed to do in order to update this form rule. And then the actual form rule itself has already been programmed to deal with a primary and a secondary, and it will check to see if they exist in the system, and if so, they will retrieve them. If not, they will go on to the next step. If I go to the posting, first of all, that's the creating the primary and secondary, which needed to be updated. I needed to define a secondary name prefix where the information is going to be taken from. It's going to be taken from a field as title, as opposed to title. We haven't actually looked at the sections and lines, which I'll show to you in a moment, that we updated. I'm showing you the form rules first. Maybe I should have done that previously. And then we have the create account, which I just updated to joint because it could be a joint account now. And here I defined the relationship to the account. The main taxpayer, the primary is the main taxpayer, and this one is going to be the spouse. And that's what needed to be done in order to be able to support primary and secondary. However, as I mentioned before, we didn't look yet at the sections and lines that we needed to update. So let's look at that on the main tab. If I go down, what you'll see is that I updated the personal details section. And if I go on, easy if I actually just click on the section, you'll be able to see what I did larger. You'll see that I added in a label to just define the primary taxpayer, and I added 2 labels, and here secondary taxpayer. And this is the original list, the title, first name, last name, ID type. What I did in this case for the secondary was add in exactly the same title, first name, last name, ID type, ID number. And let's just have a look at what I needed to do for each one of these added fields. So here, the title is exactly like the title of the primary, except for the business name has to have a unique name. So I added just a prefix S for secondary. Display sequence is obviously different. I just set it to be an optional because I wanted this form to work for even whether I wanted it had a secondary or not. But in terms of this information over here, the field definition, well, the field definition is exactly the same as the primary. I'm still using the drop down of the prefixes that we had, and the title name is the same, so there's no changes there. But if I go on to the first name now for the secondary, you'll see here again, the name is I just put an S here and an S for the business name. Sequence is different. I made sure that all these applicabilities are optional so that I don't need to have a secondary. However, here it's interesting. the related form field, there is an underlying field in the tax form table for the secondary. So I'm not for the, as we saw for the title, but for the first name and last name we do. So we actually have to map correctly the names, so the fields to the correct field. So the first name here is going to be mapped to secondary first name. In terms of the label, though, it just shows first name. I didn't want to have the word secondary in the actual title, in the actual label. And that's true also for last name. I think I clicked actually on the wrong last name. I think that's the primary one. So you can see that's the primary one whose related form is last name. And if I compare that now to the last name of it's called secondary last name. And again, the updates are, I mentioned before, S last name, this is optional. And this is true also for ID type and ID number. Also, they're mapped to fields in the table, tax form table, and so it's called secondary person ID. But again, the actual description is just use existing ID type. And finally, the same thing for the ID number. Map to the secondary person ID, label just shows ID number, business name is unique, and I made the required fields to set to be to be optional. Okay, so that shows you how we can support pretty simply this tax form not only for one taxpayer but also for a secondary as well. So now we're going to add another tax form and show you how we add the address information into a tax form. So what I've done is added in a new section called address information, and there you can fill in the information for address for the street, city, state, zip, and country. And the way I've configured this, you'll see in a moment, is such that this address will be associated to both the taxpayer, the primary, and the secondary. So let's just show an example with that by filling in this information and seeing what it creates, and then we'll look at the form rules to see how this was done. Again, I'm going to just add in so I filled in some personal details. Now this address, I'm going to just make up a street name. And I'm going to put some tax details as well. And I'm going to save that. Let's just show you what is created as a result of this. Validate the form, and then I'm going to post the form. And we didn't get a warning saying that there was no address, of course, because we added an address in. And let's just look at the person entities that we have created. If I go to this person, you will see that there is an address associated with John Piper, and this has been created. If, in fact, this address already existed in the system, then it will just simply retrieve it and use it, but obviously won't create a new one. If I click on the address, you'll see the information has been added in. And for example, in relationships, you can see who this particular address is associated with, and you'll see it's associated with both Piper, Jane, and John. Okay, so how did we do that? If we look at the form rules, and you go to the create person form rule, you'll see that we have defined here use form address for primary taxpayer, what type of address type that we want to use here at home, and do we want it to be associated with the primary and the secondary, or one or the other. So in this case we've set for both of them that should be set for their address. And that's basically how we added in this particular address information to this tax form. Again, this doesn't necessarily fulfill everyone's requirements for how the address should work, and you wouldn't perhaps need to do something slightly differently, but this is a good example of how Base has implemented adding the address into the forms. So what have we seen in this lesson? We've seen that we can actually go back to some base form rules and add in extra functionality related to primary and secondary taxpayers, address information, and this really underlines something that we've mentioned a few times already, that you need to understand in detail what these base form rules do, and that sometimes there is quite a lot of configuration that needs to be done in order to configure correctly. Not only is it heavy on configuration, but it also has a very specific implementation. It deals with a specific example of how to create or to check for an entity, and this particular form rule might not necessarily be the one that will be chosen at implementation in a real customer site. Sometimes these base form rules are just a starting point or an example so that customers can actually understand how a suggestion of how to actually implement. And sometimes there'll be a need to adjust a base form rule and create your own custom one, something that we will see now in the next lesson. We're looking at custom form rules.